Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. Welcome to the Skoll World Forum session entitled Funders Speak, Leveraging the SDGs to Work for All. My name is ARLENE Wilson Grant, and I'm the Director of Grants Management for the Disability Rights Fund. I'm pleased to be moderating today's session with a distinguished panel of guests that represent a number of different foundations that are doing innovative funding and work to improve the lives of persons with disabilities globally, including using the Sustainable Development Goals and other instruments to further this work. More importantly, these funders are working to center persons with disabilities in their SDG efforts to ensure inclusion, participation, and contribution. In a moment, I'll be asking each panelist to briefly introduce themselves, but before I do that, I'd like to review a few housekeeping notes for our audience members. The first is that the call is being captioned in real time, and if you would like to access the closed captioning button, please do so in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom window. If you would like to receive a link to a website that will also provide real-time captioning, we have provided the link in the chat box. Please note that there's an approximate 5-second delay between speaking and caption transmission. International Sign Interpretation is also being provided during this call. If audience members would like to view this throughout the call, please pin the International Sign Interpreter's Zoom box using the pin feature. While audience members' mics and videos will be muted and videos will be turned off during the call, we invite you to ask questions by using the chat box feature in Zoom. Please feel free to provide questions throughout the session, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation to respond. Please also include your name and organization that you represent when sending your questions, as this will aid with the transcription and international sign interpretation. Also include if your question is directed to a specific panelist or for the entire panel. Finally, we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can during our hour-long presentation. However, if we don't, feel free to include your contact information in the chat box and we can follow up after the call as needed. So without further ado, I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves by providing their name, the organizations that they represent, and a brief summary about the work that they're doing and how it's relevant to today's topic. So I'll start with Diana.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Diana SAMARASAN. I'm the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund and its sister organization, the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, which are global participatory grant makers supporting disability movements across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. Since 2008, with the support of a diversity of funders, including government agencies like the UK's Department for International Development and the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, private foundations like Open Society and Ford, and individuals, we have given out over 35 million US in 100 to 125 grants per year to organizations of persons with disabilities to lead the achievement of rights. Leave no one behind is key to what we do. Since 2016, we've been supporting our staff and our grantees to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals into all of our work. More than 50% of our grants go to emergent and grassroots organizations of persons with disabilities and groups of persons with disabilities who are marginalized even within the disability movement, such as women with disabilities, Indigenous persons with disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, young persons with disabilities, etc. For the majority of our grantees, we are their very first donor. Hand over to the next.
Great. Thank you, Diana. Chris?
Thank you. My name is Chris Cardona. I'm a program officer in the philanthropy portfolio at the Ford Foundation, based out of New York City. for a number of years, we have supported the SDG philanthropy platform, which I'll talk about more later in the discussion, which is a space for private funders to engage with the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals. As well, we've been on a journey over the last 3 or 4 years as a foundation to adopt greater disability inclusion in our practice using a disability justice framework. So excited to hear from folks and to learn and to share a little bit about what we're doing on both of those fronts.
This is Arlene. Thank you, Chris. And MYROSLAVA?
Thank you. So my name is MYROSLAVA TATARYN, and I am the program officer managing disability grants at WELLSPRING Philanthropic Fund, which is a foundation based in the US, but that funds human rights work and economic and social justice work worldwide.
Thank you very much. And next to Kimberly.
Yes, hi. Very nice to be here with you all today. I'm Kimberly O'Haver, and I work with the Human Rights Initiative at the Open Society Foundations, and within the Human Rights Initiative, we have a disability rights team, and that's where I sit. My focus there, or our focus actually, working with disability has always, or at the beginning, was about promoting the ratification and implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think we've gotten pretty far with that. And when the Sustainable Development Goals came in, that added a new way to support the link to the convention and to support groups, especially those that Diana mentioned that are the marginalized within the marginalized, to fight for their rights all around the world. And we have usually tried to make sure that groups of people with psychosocial disabilities or intellectual disabilities are represented, people with invisible disabilities are represented, but it really depends on the context of who's marginalized or in different parts of the world. So I guess I'll stop there and we can talk more later, but I just want to say that the Disability Rights Fund is actually one of our grantees, so, and they are doing really amazing work on the linkages of the CRPD and the SDGs, so I think we can get into more of that later.
This is Arlene. Thank you, Kim, for your introduction. And next we'll move on to Carla.
Yes, well, hello, here from Spain. I'm Carla Bonino. I'm very happy to take part in this virtual forum. I am the Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability Head of Unit of the UNSA Foundation. And I would like just to share a few words about my organization. The UNSA Foundation's headquarters are in Madrid, Spain, where I am speaking from right now. And our mission is to promote the quality of life of people with disabilities, all types of disabilities, and their families, focusing on the areas of training, employment, and universal accessibility. The UNSA Foundation is founded by ONCE, which is the national organization of the Spanish blind, and it also comprises in its board of trustees the main organizations representing people with disabilities in the country and the Disability National Council itself. The UNSA Foundation is formed by a team of more than 500 women and men, almost 80% with disabilities. And in order to implement our foundational mission, we collaborate at national, European, and international level with public authorities, private companies, academia, foundations, and others to contribute to a more sustainable and inclusive society that leaves no one behind. Among other platforms, we are members of the European Foundation Center, key to promoting the role of foundations in Europe. And finally, let me share that we are part of, as the UNSA Foundation is part of the wider ONCE social group, composed by its founder, ONCE, and Ilunion, which is the socially responsible business branch of the group. In total, ONCE social groups employs more than 73,000 workers being 58% people with disabilities.
Great. This is Arlene. Thank you, Carla, for that introduction, and thank you all. We again have some fantastic people who are part of the panel, and will speak to some very interesting vantage points around this topic. I'd just like to remind the audience that if you would like to submit questions, please feel free to do so in the chat function. We will be answering questions towards the end of the presentation. And with that, why don't we launch into our first set of questions? The first is for Chris from the Ford Foundation. Why is it important for foundations to contribute to achievements of the SDGs? And in particular, how is the Ford Foundation doing this, and how does disability fit in?
Thank you. I appreciate the ritual of waiting for the message to pop up of the host will now unmute you. I like it. It feels very, very civilized and calls us on us to be more patient, which I think a lot of us are experiencing at this particular moment in time.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you. I would say that the SDGs have come along at an interesting time in the evolution of private philanthropy. They call for us to let go of our individual theories of change, just as more of us are clinging ever more tightly to them. In this way, they are, I think, a useful corrective to some notable trends in private philanthropy. And for that reason alone, not to mention others, they're worth embracing. I would say our work on the SDGs and on disability inclusion is a case in point. It's a story of the right hand not knowing what the left is doing, of siloing inaction. So for several years leading up to the SDGs, we were active in supporting a key element of that process, civil society engagement. And we contributed to the development of Goal 11 on accessible cities through the organizations that we funded. We also supported a number of women's organizations and feminist movements that led to Goal 5 on gender equity, as well as gender being incorporated across all 17 goals. So I think those were hopefully useful in helping to shape the SDGs, but we missed out on something. We didn't have a holistic enough view of our work to meaningfully encompass the role of people with disabilities. That became evident when in 2015, just as the goals were being ratified, we refocused all of our grant making to address inequality. We spent a lot of time developing a framework that encompassed political, economic, social, and cultural inequality. We even named, quote, persistent prejudice and discrimination as a key driver of inequality. But we did not name people with disabilities as a core constituency in doing so. As a result, we had program strategies on things like equitable housing, the future of work, youth opportunity, that did not adequately address the needs and protagonism of people with disabilities. The irony is, we had an encompassing framework right there at hand. The SDGs named disability 19 times. And yet, like so many funders these days, we felt the need to define our own theory of change and our own approach to the work. What I think we've been learning is the value of more encompassing frameworks like the SDGs and the limitations of more siloed approaches. We're at our most creative and effective when we build connections across program strategies. And we're trying to apply this lesson in our work on disability inclusion. We take a human rights approach to disability. We abide by the principle, nothing about us without us. We emphasize intersectionality, or the connection of disability, discrimination, and stigma and inclusion to other forms of inequality. And we seek to lead with humility by telling the story, as I'm doing now, of how we got it wrong and how we've diligently worked to do better. So we're definitely still on that path, and have sought to apply these principles in work both in our grant making and our operations, which I'd be happy to speak about more during the Q&A. I would conclude by adding one of the things we've been supporting is a disability and philanthropy forum for funders in the US to support this. And that is also related to the SDG philanthropy platform that we have been supporting, as I mentioned, for a number of years. Again, it's interesting that we had these kinds of resources, the solutions that we needed at hand, and this is the challenge of private funders being ever more focused on our strategies. We're able to make more impact by being more targeted, but when we move on, we move on. And that, I feel, is why the SDGs are so useful. When funders move on, they remain. I wish we'd learned that lesson sooner. It might have helped accelerate our work on disability inclusion. So I would say it's important for foundations to help to look to the SDGs to see where we might be missing important connections among our strategies, because you never know what you'll find. Thank you.
Great. This is Arlene. Thank you, Chris. And this is, I think you've highlighted some really important ways in which the Ford Foundation has engaged with the SDGs and used it as kind of a mirror through which you look at your own internal policies, procedures, grant making, and ways that you were looking to further include persons with disabilities throughout your work. So thank you for that. And with that in mind, I'd like to actually pivot to Carla, because I understand that Fundacion ONCE has recently completed a survey looking at how foundations are engaging with the SDGs to enhance disability inclusion. So that's a great segue to you. And I'm wondering if you can share some examples from the survey, as well as how the organization is aligning its work with the SDGs.
Yes, thank you, Arlene. Well, let me start saying that the UNCE Foundation is developing a partnership initiative called Disability Hub Europe, co-funded by the European Social Fund, and it's aimed at working on the binomial disability and sustainability in line with the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Some of our international partners are the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, Global Reporting Initiative, the companies Dow and L'Oreal, and European platforms such as the European Disability Forum and CSR Europe. Within this initiative, Disability Hub Europe, the UNCE Foundation collaborates also with the European Foundation Center I mentioned before, and its Disability Thematic Network. And together we have carried out a research called European Philanthropy at the Nexus of Disability and the SDGs, which is about to be published. This research is focused on how the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs are serving as a framework for foundations to develop the action on disability inclusion, and includes examples and reflections of 11 relevant foundations from 9 countries: France, UK, Italy, Spain, Austria, Ireland, Netherlands, Turkey, and Georgia. One of the main conclusions is that the philanthropic organizations in Europe are well positioned to adopt the SDGs as a useful guiding tool to think differently about their impact and strategy. It was also found that many foundations are working towards the SDGs in their disability inclusion action, whether they explicitly say it or not. And in this sense, the publication found that, taking into consideration that the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs have become a top issue in the global agenda, efforts by the philanthropic sector to better link both internally and externally their activities to the SDGs can be a powerful way to enhance foundations' visibility and to reinforce the value of their already significant social contribution. Furthermore, the SDGs can serve as a guide to make interlinkages more evident and to ensure that the broader picture is visible while organizations are pursuing their particular philanthropic goals. Also, the SDGs framework can function as an important reminder that there is no goal reached by one single sector alone, and that already the growing diversity, equality, and inclusion agenda for philanthropy can be strengthened. Finally, the research underlines the need to use disaggregated data, in this case related to people with disabilities. Now, going to the second part of your question about how the UNS Foundation is aligning its work with the SDGs, we have conducted an internal analysis and reflection to specifically identify how our work connects with each of the 17 SDGs and its 169 targets. We believe it's increasingly important to be able to explain yourself as an organization in the framework of the 2030 Agenda. We're finding more and more contexts where we're even required to show how we contribute to the SDGs by public institutions, donors, and partner companies and organizations. Our mission and programs are directly linked to SDG 4 on quality and inclusive education, SDG 5 on gender equality. We also apply the intersectionality perspective, SDG 8 on inclusive and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all, SDG 10 on reduced inequality, SDG 11 on inclusive and sustainable human settlements, and SDG 17 on partnerships for the goals. Complementarily, our work contributes to other SDGs, including those ones related to climate change, which we are improving our work on. Just to give you some figures as regards SDG 4 and 8, I can share that in 2019, under our programs, more than 1,200 jobs have been created for people with disabilities. More than 18,000 people with disabilities have been trained, and more than 900 students with disabilities have received scholarships to consolidate their university studies. I think I will stop here for now, and I'm happy to receive any other questions in the further discussion.
This is Arlene. Thank you, Carla, and thank you for sharing UNSE's report, as well as examples about how your foundation is working with the SDGs. I think one of the things that struck me about your comments was the idea that as part of this study, one of the things that has come out of it is that no goal is reached by one sector alone. And certainly we're all representing foundations, but our key partner in all of this is persons with disabilities and organizations led by persons with disabilities. And so I'd like to bring Kimberly into the conversation because I'd like to have her speak to how has concrete inclusion of persons with disabilities in the SDGs bolster work led by organizations of persons with disabilities on the ground. I know that there's some really exciting things that are happening that are led by our grantee organizations.
Great, thank you, Arlene. Yes, I can speak to that. So I want to build on what Carla was saying about the SDGs as a framework for action. And I want to give an example of an organization of young people, both with and without disabilities, which is working currently in Latin America. It's called Meta Juvenil. And they've been a grantee of the Open Society Foundations for several years now, but at different levels. We started funding them even before the SDGs and the mentions of disabilities there became a reality. But what the SDGs did and the mentions of disabilities in the various goals did for this group was to give the young people something very concrete to put the work that they were already conducting against. So they were able to hold up they were always interested in inclusive development, but this was a way to say, oh wait, look, somebody at a higher level in a higher place has deemed this really important, and so now it justifies what we're doing in a different way. Not that it wasn't justifiable, but it gave it extra oomph and some teeth to move forward. It gave them a lot of international legitimacy. One of the young people working involved with Meta Juvenil actually went to work at the FUNDACION, and I don't know if she's still there, but she was from Uruguay, I believe. So it's also served as a bit of a developmental mentorship organization to launch these young people with this understanding of this instrument to other places. And if we think about disability and young people, these are the people who are really going to be writing the rule book for engagement. And so part of the work at Open Society Foundations has been to engage them and make sure that their voices are heard as young people with and without disabilities moving forward. So and then just to say that they are very excited about the support for inclusive education, and that's one of their main focus areas. And then I also want to give a very practical example of another grantee, which is the Disability Rights Fund, who is obviously represented on this call, of how DRF has been tracking the engagement of small groups. Like Diana said, often their support from DRF is sometimes the first support they've ever gotten, or the first very big support they've ever gotten. And the way that DRF tracks what SDGs each group is working on in each of its target countries is, I think, really important, because it allows for a further collection or study of what SDGs are being worked on where, and then allowing you to, or DRF and other organizations, to see what progress is being made toward those goals. So I'll stop there, and I hope that, I think Diana's speaking next, so I hope that's a good segue into what she wanted to speak about.
Thank you, Kimberly. You're right. That is a perfect segue to Diana. So Diana, on to you. Your question is, can you tell us about how participatory grant making at the Disability Rights Fund can help foundations engage and include persons with disabilities in contributing to the SDG achievements? And also, how is DRF's work aligning with the SDGs?
Thank you, Arlene, and thanks, Kimberly, too, for that great segue. Maybe I'll tackle the second question first, because that's where Kimberly left off, how we are aligning our work with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will make a plug, and maybe one of my staff who's on the call can write into the chat box the link to our Disability Rights Advocacy Fund website, where we have our grants directory, which is searchable by SDG goal, among other search items or search categories. So if you go to our DRAF website, you will be able to see how many of our grantees are working towards SDG Goal 5 on gender equality, how many are working towards SDG Goal 10 on inequality, etc. And also how that links to different articles of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'd be very thankful if one of the staff people can put the link to that particular grants directory on our DRAF webpage up into the chat box. Thank you. Going back to the first part of the question about how participatory grant making fits in. Within traditional philanthropy, power generally sits with those who have money. Wealthy people and institutions choose what problems to focus on and how to address them. They decide where the money goes. Participatory grant making, or participatory grant makers, like the Disability Rights Fund, aim at disrupting this dynamic as a basis for large-scale social change. Let me use the example of the evolution of the Disability Rights Fund to explain a bit more what I mean. The idea for a fund addressing disability rights came up during the process of the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The process of developing that treaty at the United Nations was very unique. It was the first time that fully 1/3 of the seats in the working group drafting the treaty were reserved for civil society, who were activists with the diversity of disabilities from around the world, with a common slogan, which you've heard a couple of times during this call, "Nothing about us without us." The CRPD, as it's known, and was adopted in 2006, for the first time explicitly recognizes that persons with disabilities are rights holders covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all other human rights treaties in the same way as everyone else. And this matters not only because it's the 21st century, people, and we should be recognizing each other for the beautiful, diverse, equal human beings we are, and not only because human rights are indivisible and universal, and because, as Agenda 2030 and the SDGs emphasize, everyone should live a life of dignity, but it also matters because of the scope of population of persons with disabilities. Even though I bet each one of you in the audience knows someone with a disability, whether that is a physical disability, sensory disability, intellectual disability, psychosocial disability, visible or invisible disability, or it's yourself. Even though we all hope to age and along the way probably acquire some disabilities, people don't actually know that much data about disability. And Carla was mentioning how important it is, therefore, to have disaggregated data. Of the more than 7 billion humans on the planet, 1 billion are persons with disabilities. That's 1 in every 7 people. And because of poverty and gender and disability and the intersections, that's 1 in every 5 women. Up until the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted, these 1 billion people around the world were not seen as full rights holders and were treated, including by donors, as end objects for charity, services, or medical intervention, and as passive recipients, not as active participants in their own lives. And in the previous global development frameworks, before the Sustainable Development Goals, persons with disabilities were not mentioned at all. The Disability Rights Fund has been building on the disability community slogan, "Nothing about us without us," and on the CRPD mandate for participation of persons with disabilities in the achievement of rights to turn this power dynamic on its head. Persons with disabilities have been and are key decision makers in what the fund does and how. Our board bylaws have a commitment to 50% or more representation of persons with disabilities in oversight of what we do and in strategic direction. Our grant-making committee, which supports strategy development at country level and makes decisions on grants about where our money goes, is half persons with disabilities and half donor representatives. And the majority of our staff come from the disability movement. This structure, in which persons with disabilities at all levels of the organization determines strategy and grants, is challenging the idea of persons with disabilities as passive recipients rather than as key actors in philanthropy or in development. And I want to tell you that this is not only the right thing to do, as Chris was mentioning earlier, but it's the smart thing to do. Who knows better about how to make grant making accessible to a variety of people with different disabilities than persons with disabilities themselves? Who knows the priorities of the movement and what supports are needed better than persons with disabilities themselves? In other words, the structure and the process of participatory grant making gives agency to people who benefit from funding to determine the priorities of their own lives. Putting decision-making about where money goes with the world's most marginalized is aligned with, as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stated it, the aim of the SDGs to turn reality into a life of dignity for all, leaving no one behind. And I wanted to give just a couple of examples of what this can mean in practice, what our grantees have been doing. So for example, in relation to SDG Goal 4, education, we gave a grant to the Independent Living Program of Persons with Disabilities in Oyo State, and they have been training disabled persons organizations to participate as members of a local committee addressing the Oyo State model education systems with the aim of advocating for an inclusive education curriculum and accessibility of school buildings. In relation to, in Uganda, we have been supporting the Uganda National Action on Physical Disability, which is developing enforcement mechanisms for implementation of accessibility standards in Uganda's National Building Code to ensure that the construction industry adopts accessibility indicators in line with Sustainable Development Goal 11 on sustainable cities. Right now, as we face a pandemic, the specter of leaving people behind is real. This is why it is so important that when we act on the SDGs, we remember that they are based in a human rights approach of valuing all humans and leaving no one behind, and that this is key to sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for that overview about the work that DRF is doing, including participatory grant making, which is an important tool in terms of engaging and including persons with disability in decision making. I'd like to move to MYROSLAVA, who is going to be addressing the question about why inclusion of persons with disabilities is so crucial to ensuring the realization of the SDGs. Miro?
Thank you. So I think that Diana already started to mention the UNCRPD and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And for some of you in the audience, I could see your names, and many of them are familiar and know the CRPD very well. But for those of you that don't, I just wanted to go back to the principles in the CRPD and the definitions. And although we shy away from a definition of disability per se, I think that the idea that was first enshrined and broadly publicized internationally in the convention was that people with disabilities include those persons who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which crucially, in interaction with various barriers in society that hinders their participation, that's the definition. Like, it's that interaction between social barriers and the persons is crucial in how we conceptualize disability internationally, and that's enshrined in the convention. And this is important for the SDGs, because I think that if we're really, the SDGs apply to countries low income, middle income, high income, and it's talking about what kind of societies are we building? How are we building our cities? How are we building our communities to be inclusive and to be sustainable in the long term? So if we're really true to those principles, then applying the principles enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and really looking at the details of what it takes to have disability inclusive societies, then we're realizing that those complying to and ensuring that the rights enshrined in the Convention are realized, then that brings us so much further along in terms of realizing the SDGs. Because if we're building societies that are open and accessible to people with a wide variety of impairments, physical, mental, intellectual, sensory, then we're realizing that these societies are going to be more inclusive and open, not just for those people that identify as disabled people, but also people who may have impairments for temporarily, or because of age, or because of injury, because somebody is carrying groceries or carrying children and are having trouble making it up a set of stairs. That's the most basic examples, but it's easy for this for this purpose. But we're seeing that then immediately our communities are going to be ones where it's easier to move around. It's easier to communicate in different ways if we don't know a language, if maybe we don't read a certain language, and there will be alternate ways to access information. So that's really why looking at disability rights and getting to know the Convention on the Rights of Disabilities and the principles enshrined therein are a way to, like, are a tool to help disability, to help the advancement of SDGs and ensuring that they really apply to all, to everyone. On the at the inverse as well, the SDGs are a real opportunity for those of us who've been working on the implementation of disability rights before the SDGs. Having the SDGs there now for the last 5 years is helping to create kind of the fertile soil that we need in order to realize rights, because we need communities, we need governments and decision makers. We need to have private and like the private sector, the public sector all on board, and the SDGs really have that aim of stating and reminding countries that this is a process, this is a long-term process, and that we need to recognize the intersections between health, between how we build our cities, between how we fund our education, that all those things interact in order to make life better for all of our citizens. So I think that the SDGs and the CRPD are tools available. Our governments have committed to them. The CRPD is enshrined in international law, and 181 countries have ratified it. The SDGs also are similarly universal in that it's not just for low-income countries, as I already mentioned. They are there for countries around the world, and they're this unifying force, and that they can really feed off of each other. And also with the SDGs, there's no excuse really for people to say, oh, that's just a disability issue, that's for another minute. SDGs means that nobody has an excuse to say that, no, that's not up to me. It's really all of our responsibilities, and it touches on all facets, all ministries, all issue areas. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mira. This is Arlene. I appreciate the passion that you brought to your question, and you and our other panelists have really, I think, illuminated a lot of different ways in which the SDGs is helping foundations to identify and benchmark the ways in which they are engaging with and supporting persons with disabilities, using it across different industries and sectors, as well as using other instruments like the UN CRPD to ensure that persons with disabilities, again, are at the center of this work and their voices are not left behind. So thank you for that. With that, I'd like to again invite our audience to submit questions via the chat box. We have quite a few that have come in, and in a moment I'll be posing a few of those questions to our panelists, but again, I'd like to invite you to do that at this time. And so with that, we did receive a question, which I'm going to direct to Chris from the Ford Foundation. And this is a question from Sean Ramshore, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. And his question is, how effective or ineffective have collaborators from the US been in the way of grant development for global disability rights movements?
Thank you for that question, John, and I would be very interested to hear what others have to say to that as well. And my colleague, Catherine Townsend, who is our Disability Inclusion Advisor at the Ford Foundation, is on the line as well. If she could be unmuted, she can speak to that as well. I would say this is an ongoing challenge, I think, more generally for funders in the US. There's a relatively limited number that have a global focus. And so even thinking about the portfolio that I program, it's focused on the US. So I think there's a context of an overall challenge of US collaborators having the focus and the relationships to be able to develop grants in an effective way for global rights movements of any kind. The human rights frame within the funding world is not as widely disseminated as I think any of us would like. It's language that's the framework that's common in the rest of the world and not as well adopted in the US. So I think contextually, it's a challenging environment from a funding perspective. Catherine, what would you add to that?
Thanks, Chris. I think one of the other things I would add to it is the very different policy frame that we have here in the US. Sorry, could you hold on one moment? My family is in the background. This is the reality of COVID-19, everyone. It's the very different policy background we have in the US. So with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the failure of the US to ratify the CRPD, I think, unfortunately, we don't have, and we haven't embraced the frame of the SDGs, as everybody is talking about. And so I think it makes it particularly complicated in order to connect work that's happening in the US with global work. At the same time, I think that, we might see with COVID-19 potential areas where we can increase that collaboration.
Thank you, Catherine and Chris. Would any of our other panelists like to address that question? And just to repeat the question again is, how effective or ineffective have collaborators from the US been in the way of grant development for global disability rights movements? MYROSLAVA, would you like to?
I just wanted to mention that I think that private foundations have been very instrumental in seeding and getting a lot of targeted disability rights initiatives off the ground. And that started more than a decade ago with the founding of the Disability Rights Fund. But also there have been foundations like OSF that have been funding the work, and actually there are foundations based in the Nordic countries and other European countries that have been doing this work for a long time. But over the years, we've found more and more bilateral governmental donors also funding disability inclusive development initiatives more and more. And so that's brought in a broader range of partners and different types of funding into the fore. I think if we look at other issue areas, it's still relatively under-resourced, but we are seeing more donors. So I think that that's also changing kind of the countries that are involved. And I think that in the US, overall, there's a concentration of private foundations that there isn't the same culture of private philanthropy. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's just like particularly perhaps concentrated in the US. But on a public donor side and governmental donors, you're seeing involvement from an increasing number of countries from Europe and from other parts of the world.
Thank you, Miro. And thank you, Sean, for the question. We have another question that recently came in, which, Mira, if you don't mind, I'd like to direct to you. This is a question from Mosharraf Hossein. The SDGs were adopted more than 5 years ago. Yes, it's been successful to engage civil society, but how much have the SDGs changed the lives of people with disabilities on the ground in developing countries following the principles of leave no one behind?
Thank you. Well, I think that as with most international agreements, it's not something that happens overnight. So I think that it is an ongoing process, and that that applies to all of the aspects of the SDGs. So I think that, yeah, I agree that the SDGs haven't meant that we immediately see people's lives changing radically overnight or even in 1 year since the adoption of the SDGs, but the same goes for the CRPD, and the convention has been enshrined in international law for over 10 years now. Does that mean that it's worthless and that we shouldn't have gone to that trouble? No, definitely not. I think that the changes is progressive, and we hope that the SDGs help to also channel more, like for countries, higher income countries, for them to recognize their roles in development funding and in solidarity, and equalizing kind of inequalities and opportunities worldwide. But it's of course an ongoing struggle. But we hope that the SDGs will be one more way that works. Whether the SDGs have single-handedly helped to elevate the cause of people with disabilities and the need for disability inclusion, I mean, personally, I think that, you know, just as disability helps us learn about diversity, we can't ever put all our eggs in one basket. We need to look at different mechanisms, different donors, different approaches. But where I think the SDGs have a lot of potential, and where I hope that there has been change, but I'm not sure if you'd be in a better position on the ground working with an NGO to see if you've seen that change. But I think that it's a way to insert the need for disability inclusion into mainstream development work. So earlier, when I was working for an NGO, I think that since the adoption of the SDGs, what we saw is that country development plans and the plans that were negotiated between a donor government and a recipient country, that they were using the language of the SDGs. And because there is a language of disability and inclusion, the language of disability inclusion in the SDGs, it then means that disability inclusive language makes it into the country development plans. So that chain is helping, I think. But again, I would turn the question back to Musharraf, but we might not have time. But I think that it, you know, people working on the ground in development and national level development are the ones that will be the best judges in terms of whether or not that's happening.
Thank you, Miro, and thank you for that response, and also thank you to Musharraf for the question. As Miro mentioned, we do have a number of questions that have come in. Unfortunately, we are running short on time. This has been such a rich conversation, but I would encourage audience members that if you have additional questions and you would like us to follow up after today's call, please feel free to leave your contact information and your question in the chat box, and we would be happy to follow up with you. And with that, I'd like to, with the few minutes that we have left, would like to open the floor up to our panelists to provide some closing remarks before we close the call at 7 a.m. Eastern time. Again, thank you for all of your thoughts and the information that you've shared so far. So I'd like to start with Chris with your closing remarks.
I was over eager and pressed the button before it was time, and my little invite to unmute disappeared for a second. Sorry about that. I think it's really important for foundations to do our own housekeeping when it comes to disability inclusion. That's been something that we've spent a lot of time and leadership focus doing. We're still very much on that journey. I think there's an appropriate amount of internal reflection to be done, but also to learn by doing. We've been funding in this area. We developed an internal matching program to incentivize our different program teams to start funding with clear principles around disability justice. And we've seen that happen within the space of a year or two. So that balance of internal reflection and moving forward into action based on some clear principles that are available in the field feels key. For funders in the US, there's a Disability and Philanthropy Forum that would encourage folks to join. And for those interested in learning more about how to engage with the SDGs, sdgphilanthropy.org is the site for the SDG Philanthropy platform, where you can connect with a multi-sector effort to align foundations to the work of the SDGs. Finally, the Council on Foundations is hosting a pledge for funders in the time of COVID-19 to be more flexible in the support that we give grantees. We have upwards of 500 foundations that have signed the pledge, and that is available at the Council on Foundations website, cof.org. So there are a number, for funders interested in these topics, there are a number of communities and platforms to join to find support in engaging on this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And that's a great call to action for foundations. Diana, would you like to provide some closing remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Arlene, and thanks to everyone for sticking with us for this hour. I know there are some questions directed at the Disability Rights Fund in the chat that I will attempt to get back to outside of the scope of this presentation. As we end, I just want to bring the current situation that we're all facing, COVID-19, which is connecting all of us, back into the picture, because as we face this pandemic, leaving people behind is very real. The idea that it is okay to value some people over others, whether that's because of age, health status, class, or disability, which really are discriminatory and even eugenic ideas, is unfortunately overwhelmingly present. Our grantees on the ground in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, are facing situations where persons with disabilities are forgotten or worse, devalued, whether that is in lack of accessible communications from governments about public health measures, so no captioning, no sign language interpretation, no documents in Braille, no documents in easy to read, whether it's about inaccessible public sinks or health facilities or pumps, whether it's about food distribution programs that miss out persons with disabilities because they have not been counted in national census, or because the distribution is not accessible, or whether it's in being turned away from testing or treatment because of having a disability. Despite this, and through decades of learning how to survive, persons with disabilities are resilient. And we have many grantees who are addressing this situation on the ground and need support. A couple of examples. In Indonesia, we have a group, a coalition of organizations of persons with disabilities who wrote an open letter to the President, Joko Widodo, responding to the state's disregard of the right to information for the deaf community. And with that letter, as a follow-up, the official messages from the President started being accompanied by a sign language interpreter within days of the letter's release in the public media. In Rwanda, one of the sign language videos released by our grantee, the Rwanda National Union of the Deaf, was in partnership with local authorities to announce COVID-19 prevention measures. And in Uganda, the National Union of Persons with Disabilities of Uganda has worked with the Ministry of Health to develop standard operating procedures on how to address persons with disabilities during COVID-19, and there are many more examples. So I just end with saying, please remember that there are organizations of persons with disabilities out there needing support.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. Miroslava, a few brief closing remarks.
Sure. I'll try to be very quick, but just to say that I think that disability appears everywhere. So anytime we're talking about inequality, whether it's gendered inequality, socioeconomic inequality, geographic inequality, then there will be disability dimensions. And I think that that's what COVID is showing us as well, that these inequalities are not new. The reasons why disabled people are particularly worried about what's happening or not happening in terms of COVID response, those are not new marginalizations, but it is bringing it to the fore. And so no matter what thematic area you work on, no matter whether you're working in healthcare or in education or in commerce, there will be a disability dimension, and there's something that you can do to make your work more inclusive. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Miroslava. Carla, do you have any closing remarks for us?
Well, adding to what the other speakers were saying, and particularly concerning COVID, I would like to thank all the comments on the situation of people with disabilities. In Spain, we have also an alarming situation. I won't extend too much on that. And what I would like to say is that the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities left very clear for a wider audience that disability is a matter of human rights. And I think the SDGs, what gives us is the opportunity to understand that disability is also a matter of sustainability and sustainability development. And this opens a lot of ways to work, understanding that sustainability is not only environmental, has not only an environmental dimension, but also a social dimension. And inclusiveness is part of the agenda and sustainability. Also, I think the SDGs gives us the opportunity to, and knowing that disability is there to work on important trends such as the future of work, the transformation to a low carbon and digital economy, not forgetting about people with disabilities, and also to push companies and organizations to disclose, for example, non-financial information, including and reflecting the situation and how they're dealing with people with disabilities and accessibility.
Thank you, Carla. This is Arlene, and thank you again to all of our panelists for all of your thoughts and your ideas that you teed up during today's conversation, as well as illuminating the work of and the achievements of the SDGs, particularly as it pertains to current real-time events with COVID-19. And I would just add that in addition to using it as a way to kind of illuminate the inequalities that we're seeing with our current global events, that we should also use it moving forward as we look to rebuild post-COVID-19. From things like, as Carla mentioned, infrastructure, sustainability, as well as access to information, and ensuring that human rights are not eliminated or decreased for persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups. So with that, I'd again like to thank Diana, Miroslava, Carla, Kimberly, who unfortunately had to leave a few moments ago, as well as Chris. Thank you so much for your time today. And also a special thank you to Sherry, who is our real-time captioner, as well as to Chris, who is our international sign interpreter. We appreciate all of your help and your support for this call. And again, if you would like to follow up and receive a recording of today's call, feel free to email me. My address is in the chat box, and we'd be happy to get a copy of that recording to you. And with that, thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend.